Welcome to this joint meeting hosted by Northeast Risk and Northwest Risk. My name is Shika Singh, and I'm part of the Northeast Risk leadership team. And I just wanted to let people know that this is being recorded. And if we could have folks please keep themselves muted until it's time for question and answer period. Just wanted to show the next slide. The agenda is we'll have a brief introduction. We want to talk about the organizations, kind of go over the botanical introduction, talk about erosion, resiliency, and then we'll wrap it up. This event is eligible for one continuing education credit. And for that, we ask people to screenshot the first slide of the presenter's presentation, as well as the last slide of the presenter's presentation. And then, we can submit, you can submit for the continuing education credit that way. So a little bit about our organization, Northeast Risk. It aims to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species and climate change by synthesizing relevant science and communicating the needs of practitioners to researchers, building stronger scientist practitioner communities, and conducting priority research. We, kind of started off in the Northeast, and it was born out of a need expressed by invasive species practitioners to better understand how climate change was going to impact some of their work. And it was the first meeting was held in 2016, and it's a growing and thriving community. And so the Northeast leadership team composed of 20 plus people who meet on a weekly basis to kind of coordinate some of our activities, and I'll talk about some of those activities in the next couple of slides. We also have about over 750 folks who engage with us, making Northeast Risk a very useful resource for folks. And our partners in this event is a Northwest Risk Management Network. They're new, and they started in 2021. And their aim is to help practitioners within the federal, tribal, state, and local agencies and organizations to integrate climate change science, adaptation with invasive species prevention, early detection, control, monitoring, and research activities. And they are funded by the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they're run through the University of Washington Climate Group. And they serve Washington, Idaho, Oregon, British Columbia, and the neighboring states and provinces in that area. The Northwest Core team, has a variety of representatives, and they have about 20 folks on their advisory team, ranging from federal, state, local agencies, NGOs, colleges, and universities. And some of the cool things that, the risk does is that, we synthesize some of the science, the management challenges and summaries. We also communicate with various practitioners by doing surveys and workshops, building communities. We do symposiums, webinars, as well as doing, priority research, and we publishing papers and presentations and so on. So with that, I am going to stop sharing and leave it to our presenters. So Brian, I think. Perfect.
Excellent. All right. Well, hi. Yeah, Elizabeth and I are going to be your presenters. We're going to be swapping back and forth over the course of the presentation, although I am driving the slideshow. So if Elizabeth seems to screw up the slideshow, that's me. So who am I? I run my own company focused on ecological restoration, certified through a couple of different things you see up here on the board. I've got a little bit of a peer review background with publishing on knotweed, especially in the case of floods and erosion in that context. And then here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where I am, I've been involved with the state's wetland protection law which is initially engaged with by town level volunteer groups. So that's sort of who I am. Elizabeth, who are you?
Thanks, Brian. My name is Élisabeth Groeneveld. I'm a research professional at Laval University. I work in the research lab of invasive plants, and we focus mainly on knotweed, hogweed, and the invasive Phragmites.
All right. So just a broad outline of what we're going through so you know what we're going to be getting into. We had one of those slides already, but this is a little bit more dialed in. So that's what we're doing. More importantly, what we're not doing, right? There's a lot of rabbit holes you can fall down with knotweed. And so we're not really going to get into the genetics and the hybrids. We're not going to go too deep on IDing the species and the various confusions about what to call this plant or not. And we're really going to stay out of management. That is a deep, deep, deep rabbit hole. There's going to be a hat tip to early detection and rapid response, but otherwise we're going to try to stay away from that. What we are going to start off with is that many of you might know this plant as Japanese knotweed. Taking a cue from the Kings County noxious weed list and that board out there, who I think might have been 2020, might have been 2021. Hopefully somebody here in the comment section can correct me on that one. But they started renaming their invasives and taking out the regional names, the national names, the place names for a couple of reasons. One of them being botanical information. Knowing the botany of a plant is usually much more helpful, especially in an invasive context, than knowing where it came from. Knowing where it came from doesn't really help you. Knowing that it's tall or short, etc., that can help you. More specifically with knotweed, in England, they have a long backstory with knotweed and impacting property damage. And you'll see in the cartoon, an English cartoon, right? Once they started calling the knotweed English, it didn't bother the guy who had it growing through his house. You get the joke there. And then Elizabeth provided this clipping from 2012 up in Quebec, where calling this the yellow peril kind of misses the point and kind of opens up a lot of racist history. So I'm taking the name, that cue that the King County folks are doing, and we're renaming it, and we're using that common name Itadori rather than the Japanese, and that applies to a couple other things. Like we'll be using the hybrid knotweed term rather than Bohemian today. So this is where Elizabeth kicks in.
So we're going to be talking about the invasive knotweeds today, and that's a complex of 3 species, at least in my area. You have the 2 parent species, the Itadori knotweed, and it can cross-pollinate with the giant knotweed, and it forms a hybrid called, hybrid knotweed. And it can be important to tell the difference between these 3 taxa because the hybrid knotweed is a more aggressive invader, and it spreads more quickly, and it is more competitive. Luckily, they're fairly easy to tell apart based just on phenotypic traits. First of all, if you look here at the leaves, you'll see that the Itadori knotweed has the smallest leaves of all 3. The tips of the leaves tend to have longer points on them. We call that acuminate. And the base of the leaves is usually truncate. It's like it's cut flat across the base of the leaf. The giant knotweed has really big leaves that are thin and papery. The base of these leaves is heart-shaped. It's very distinctive. And then the hybrid knotweed is a perfect intermediate between both of its parents. It can have cordate leaf bases, but they can also be truncate. It can have long pointy leaf tips, and it can have short, fairly blunt leaf tips. Next slide. The flowers have distinctive traits also. So for the Itadori knotweed, the most important point is all the flowers here are functionally female. They do not have working male parts. If you look at that little highlighted circle, you can see The female flower parts, you see the pistil with the styles on the end, ready to receive pollen. But it doesn't produce pollen. It doesn't produce viable pollen. It must be pollinated by either the hybrid knotweed or the giant knotweed. And at least in our area, all three are often found growing fairly close to each other. Now, the giant knotweed has tighter flower clusters, and these clusters are generally smaller than their associated leaf. Excuse me. The flowers are perfect. That means they have male and female parts. And you can see circled here on the slide the stamens that are ready to release their pollen and fertilize the nearby Japanese knotweed. And then you have the hybrid knotweed, which is intermediate, of course, between both parents. It can have perfect flowers with male and female parts, or it can have female only flowers. And in this dried specimen here, Brian, you can advance. Here you see the stamens ready to release their pollen. And on the upper photo, you can see the pistil, which has been fertilized and is already starting to form a seed. If you flip the leaves over and look at their midribs, the midrib is the main vein that grows along the back of the leaf. Now in Itadori knotweed, they're fairly square in cross section and they're covered with these little knobs or scabers. The giant knotweed is really easy to see with the naked eye. If you flip a leaf over, it looks furry. These are long trichomes and they cover the midrib, and the midrib is fairly rounded. Where it gets tricky is if you have a hybrid. The midrib can be square in cross section. Sometimes it's a bit rounded, and it will always have at least a few trichomes that are pointy. They look like little miniature teeth, and they'll be scattered along the midrib. Here's a chart that summarizes the traits of all three taxa. Now, once you get experienced with identifying them, we found we have an over 90% accuracy rate in distinguishing the different taxa, and we were able to validate most of our identifications using genotyping. One particularity that knotweed has is its rhizomes. Rhizomes are horizontal underground stems that act as storage organs. It's from the rhizomes that you get new shoots and roots. And if there's a physical disturbance, pieces of rhizomes can break off and produce a new plant.
All right, so if we have any questions, we can have a couple of questions. If not, I don't think I see anything in the chat. If people feel free, like they want to unmute themselves and ask a question, please do that.
Once, twice. Okay.
All right,
Sorry.
let's keep going.
Real quick.
Oh, did we hear?
Sorry.
Oh, did we hear?
Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
please. Yep.
Real quick, we talked about how we're shifting the naming conventions to be more useful, but what does Itadori mean?
So again, I haven't translated the Japanese personally. That's not my skill set. But supposedly Itadori is the common name used in Japan. And what it means is it's a hat tip to the number of herbal uses that the Japanese have for that plant. It translates to something loosely meaning strong knotweed. And again, that's sort of a hat tip to the herbal, medicinal, cultural, is that, all the uses for that plant. That's how I understand it. And I'm open to correction on that, but that's what I've been told.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll keep going then.
Yep.
Okay, so this is giving away the ending a little bit. When I put out a paper a couple of years ago with a couple of peers, we were trying to sort of do essentially a miniature lit review of the clues that had been scattered around the literature, that had been published, that sort of alluded to knotweeds' relationship with erosion and flooding. And so the gist of it is that the argument I'm going to put out today that Élisabeth is going to contribute to and help out with here is that knotweed sort of amplifies and exacerbates existing erosional processes, which means it's a risk to stream side, riverside, anything, whether it be ecological or built, whether it be roads, rails, buildings, or botanical communities. So how I got there begins with Tropical Storm Irene in Vermont. You can see where the flood sort of topped out up here in this image where the sand stops and the grass begins was the edge of the flood. And along those edges, over the course of experience, we've determined that was a great place to find new knotweed plants. And you'll see how sandy that is, right? We could actually dig in that sand with our bare hands as the most sort of effective means of getting rid of these plants, and we knew they were gone. Without getting into management, I think most people familiar with this plant, even a little, know that you don't get instant gratification with knotweed control, and this was instant gratification. So that sort of is what got me rolling. As I said, we could dig them up by hand. You can see me actually digging one out by hand there. And we found them in certain predictable places, right? The edges of the floodplain where the water slowed down enough, or debris piles where, the floodwaters left lots of things behind, including the knotweed. And so we were really able to sort of narrow and focus our search parameters, which was great. In the course of doing this all as well, I started to call them erosion shadows. But you can see, let me bring up the laser pointer. So you can see here, the knotweed is this sort of stalky stuff. And you can see up here, you've got leaves and leaf litter and debris right down to the water's edge. And then even through here, behind that tree, there's debris, right? And then once you get here, that brown bank kicks in, whereas up here, you don't have that. And then it continues the length of the knotweed patch. And at the same time, the main stem of the channel is way over here. And so this back channel, where arguably there's less water flowing, there's going to be less hydrological energy at play, you end up with this sort of strange pattern. And I saw things like this frequently. So I've sort of got this working hypothesis that there are potentially 3 different kinds of erosion going on. One being sort of an overland erosion, because the knotweed crowns are sort of, they set up like a plinko board a little bit. And when you get past your spring ephemerals, there's functionally no ground covers in the knotweed patch. And of course, there's exceptions to that, there always are. But that sort of lack of something to hold down the ground means that real erosion becomes more theoretically possible. This is something I've observed more. In this picture, you can see up here where sort of behind the lettering, that is the edge of the bank. And then this is the bank rolling over and falling in. And you can see the dead knotweed stalks just dragging in the waterway. And you can begin to see there's a layer here where you can see the knotweed rhizomes sticking out. But then below that, you don't see anything. And so to my mind, what's going on there is that this invasive has sort of eliminated the other botanical opportunities for some kind of structure to the soil. And it's sort of simplified and reduced what's going on in the soil. And the other part is that the rhizomes themselves seem to be encouraging the erosion, in my mind. The idea being, with all of this stuff hanging out here, when you have floodwaters that come up and these pieces sort of shake in the water, they're wiggling, right? And so that wiggle is going to loosen up the soil behind them. The other part of this is that rhizomes, being modified stems, don't really have root hairs. There's just they use a different mycorrhizal system than most native flora. And so all these really small, subtle connections between the plant and the soil there doesn't seem to be that relationship, that connection. And then this picture, which is from the Mad River up in Waitsfield, Vermont, you can see this sort of, the soil fell down, right? This is well after the flood, right? And you can see if you trace visually up here, this sort of like hanging shadow underneath the knotweed stand. So the stand is actually tallest, or not tallest, it's the furthest out towards the river at the top. And then it sort of goes backwards as you go further down. And the soil is just falling out. So a lot of this kind of thing is going on generally. So that's all sort of the process. But let's take a step back, because what I'm saying there has a lot to do with how knotweed spreads by spreading the rhizomes, as Elizabeth mentioned earlier. But that's not all that's going on, right? It's not just a rhizominously propagating. Sorry, that was terrible English. It's not just reproducing by propagule spreading because of erosion.
That's correct. Back in 2014, we wanted to know if knotweed could also reproduce by seed. And we're pretty much at the northern limit of its distribution. So we did a 500-kilometer long transect across the province, and we looked at the germination rate of seeds from 10 different cities in Quebec. And we found that seeds as far north as Quebec City, where I'm located, could germinate, and they could germinate really well. On average, 65% of the knotweed seeds were viable and could give rise to new plants. But just because they can germinate in a petri dish, nope, go back, you're too fast. Just because they can germinate in a petri dish, it doesn't mean they're actually doing that in the field. So we continued the study and we genotyped over 100 different knotweed clones along a 6-kilometer stretch of road. And on this map here, the green dots are Itadori clones, and they were all genetically identical. So it's the one female clone that was spread by fragments. In yellow, those are the hybrid clones. There was 13 of them. And it was really interesting because 10 of these clones had different genotypes, which suggests that they are in fact spreading by seed. So although yes, they can spread by seed, we at least know for the Itadori, it's almost all by fragments. So here's another study we did near Quebec City. This is on the Chaudière River. And every single Japanese knotweed clone was mapped from the headwaters of the river all the way down to the mouth. And then they were all genotyped. And what we found was there was a single Itadori clone that had been introduced upstream and then had spread downstream with the ice breakup in the spring all the way down to the mouth of the river. It was the same thing with a hybrid knotweed. There was in fact only one genotype that we discovered, and it also had been introduced around one of the larger towns and then spread downstream along the banks with the ice in the spring. And here's a picture of a big clump of knotweed that got detached and has been spreading down the bank of the river. This was a really hefty clump. But it's not only really big clumps that can also produce new plants, it's also very tiny fragments, as you'll see in another slide. So in this study, we were working with knotweed contaminated soil. And for every new knotweed plant that spread it up from the soil, I would dig it out, locate the original rhizome fragment, and weigh it. And this was the smallest fragment we found that had generated a new plant. And it weighed 1/100th of a gram. It was tiny. I couldn't believe that such a tiny little fragment could generate a new plant. But we saw this time and time again. Fragments 1, 2, 3 grams were able to grow up through a couple inches of soil and make an entire new individual. And this was in field conditions. So to answer one of the questions I saw going through in the chat, One node on a piece of fragment can give rise to a new individual. We've been curious for a long time and wanting to have scientific data to allow us to answer the question, is knotweed causing erosion along riverbanks? Based on the slides that Brian has shown, it looks really obvious. Knotweed surely must be causing erosion. You can just see it, but we needed hard scientific proof. And this was supplied to us by a graduate student, Rebecca Matt. She investigated a river that was infested with knotweed, and she took profile transects along the bank. So she took transects in 60 Japanese knotweed patches, where she used an ultra high precise GPS system to generate a bank profile. And she did 60 transects without Japanese knotweed. These measurements were taken in the fall, and then again in the spring after this ice breakup. And here's an example of a bank profile where there was no knotweed. In blue, you have the profile from November of 2018. And then in orange is the exact same site where the measurements were taken again in May of 2019. You can see very little soil was lost or gained, even though there was a massive spring flood that year. It's a completely different picture in the transects where there was knotweed. In blue, you have the profile from the month of November. And then in May 2019, after the spring floods, the transects with knotweed on average lost 3 centimeters of additional soil. That's 3 centimeters of soil eroding from the knotweed patches and being lost to the river. So to answer the question, yes, definitely. Knotweed impacts the erosion of riverbanks. And when you think that the riverbanks can be infested from wall to wall over kilometers, the additive impact of this could be huge.
All right. Thank you. We did have a couple of questions pop up. I know you answered the node one. For people controlling knotweed, how important is it to properly ID species? Like, is a knotweed when you treat it just, you know?
Is a knotweed not a knotweed?
Yeah.
It's not critically important. At least when they're propagating along a river, it is, from what we've seen, it's almost exclusively vegetative. So does it really matter if it's Bohemian or not? Probably not that much, but I think it's a good piece of information to have because it informs you. It just gives more information, knowing that Bohemian knotweed is potentially more invasive. If you have very limited resources, you could choose to target those colonies first. And it also ties into climate change. As the climate warms, we'll find viable knotweed seeds further and further north. And knowing that these seeds are viable is just one more way that this plant can potentially spread itself. The seeds can float on the water for quite a few hours. And I've also seen them being eaten by birds, which may mean it could be dispersed by birds. So it's additional information, but I think you can still jump right into eradication without knowing this. Brian, do you have any thoughts?
No, I think that's a good summary. My knotweed experience is likely predominated by the Itadori, and so, you know, the West Coast perspective, where they've got a greater variety of mixture, would be a more relevant perspective, I think. You know, and again, having not genetically ID'd all of my patches I'm working on, I'm making a few presumptions there. But yeah, I think what you said was perfect.
Thank you.
And then we also had a question kind of along with the nodes question, like, do cut above ground live canes resprout? And if they are cut and left out to dry, will those nodes still resprout after drying?
Just quickly, we did not observe any sprouting from dried stalks. And that's because our survey was done in the spring, and any fragments that we observed that had been dispersed by the floods, the stalks were already dead. So we didn't observe it, but it was very unlikely in our situation.
Yeah. I've seen green stalks resprout, but once they're dead, they're dead. And, that's in my experience, it's like a 2 to 3 week process to, have it go from fully green to fully brown.
We do have another question. What are the legal ramifications by governments for an individual that intentionally plants knotweed for gardening and landscape purposes?
Now that depends where you live. In Quebec, we do not yet have any regulations concerning the planting of invasive or potentially noxious plants. So there are no legal ramifications. Hopefully that will change soon. But I do know in other jurisdictions is different, and they're on the state lists of invasive or noxious plants where you're not allowed to plant them. So it varies state by state.
Yeah, and I'm going to punt on that a little bit because it'll come up a little bit more later, and it gets into sort of whether you've got a live plant that you're transporting versus sort of, let's say, infested soils. And right now, the infested soil question, there doesn't seem to be anything useful to sort of bring to bear, but we'll come back to that maybe in a little bit.
And how about one last question for this section, because we do have some time. What makes the hybrid more invasive? Is it the greater ability to spread via seed?
That's a really good question, and I was trying to find the answer to that in a book chapter of a book that we wrote in our lab, and I'll have to get back to you on that. If someone wants to message me, I can look up the literature that on which that statement's based.
Oh, and we have one more question that kind of someone has mentioned they've heard of chicken fence being buried with the theory that it chokes out the root system. Have you seen this be successful, or does it make sense, at least from the theoretical perspective?
Can't comment on that. We've never tried fencing.
Yeah.
I think it'd be similar to a tarp, perhaps, in which case it has to stay in place a really long time.
I've seen that in practice where it did not work. And if we have time at the end and I get a prompting, I can dig around and share some pictures. Yeah, you can see the chicken wire in the broken off knotweed piece where the knotweed grows through the chicken wire and then sort of puts out aerial roots that sort of grow back down around the chicken wire. So I don't think it's worthwhile personally.
You have to admire its tenacity. It's really quite the plant.
Excellent. How about we continue on with the third section?
Okay. So as Elizabeth was saying, data is starting to sort of come out about actual how many centimeters a year, through what process erosion might be happening. All of this text, obviously you don't need to read it. But a master's student at the University of New Hampshire figured out that there seems to be about 4 centimeters of erosion that's due primarily seemingly to mass failure. This was work done a couple of summers ago in a drought. And so there was no flooding that took place in this river, although shortly after she completed her work, it flooded. So there you go. Timing is everything. I also sort of have kept a short list going of the clues scattered about in literature. Some of them speak to certain things about the sedimentation in the water column downstream of knotweed, the genetic spread, like Elizabeth was alluding to, in different rivers. The most recent one, Michael Penn, he just sent this to me like 2 weeks ago. Something that I thought he did that was really interesting was he sort of took a history of aerial imagery and was able to sort of put together some pretty good guesses about which patch came from which flood. and really stack floods with the beginning of knotweed patches. And one of the things that's also very interesting is that he was studying islands in the river that he was working on, and the islands got taller where the knotweed hadn't mass failured into the creek. And so, in terms of amplifying and exacerbating erosion, maybe it's sort of amplifying and exacerbating natural river processes, right? So there's still work to be done to sort of pin down the data and what relationship is actually at play. That all being said, I've got one spot in southern Vermont that I just stumbled into by accident, and it shows a couple of these things sort of happening in context. And so this is Beaver Brook. We've got a lovely stand of knotweed. We've got a couple of reference points circled. The one in the river is a tire. The one up against the river is a small beaver dam. And then we've got some structures up above the bank. And you see the date there. So coming back a few years later, now we've got 2 tires in the river. So I don't know which was my original tire, but now there's 2. And you can see this dam. And, to my eye, it seems like the creek may have gotten a little bit bigger. Like it seems to have shifted. The shape of it's off. And strangely, over in that circle just downstream of the dam, there's a waterfall in the midst of the knotweed, which I found curious. That maybe there was a sewage pipe or something that I had overlooked on my initial visit, and I just didn't take the picture, right? Well, when I came back, now that I was keyed in on it and wondering what that waterfall was about, now we see there's a corner kicking in downstream of the dam. So the water, rather than sort of going over the dam or through the dam or blowing the dam out, the water chose to carve a new passage, right? And then again, dumb luck, there was a big flood event and a big portion of the bank washed away. The beaver dam, mind you, stayed, right? And so this is actually something that got my curiosity up. And I spoke to a woman at Keene State in New Hampshire who's got some expertise in beavers. And she said that based on the photos, having never seen the site, obviously, she was like, yeah, that beaver dam is kind of a giveaway dam. They're sort of meant to blow out. They don't have the structural components that make beaver dams really stick. This is a throwaway dam as far as the beaver is concerned. And the throwaway dam held together in the flood, whereas a bank full of knotweed didn't. So now I've just kept paying attention. And I go back on a relatively regular basis to see what's going on out there. And you can see what changes here is that this channel has sort of been given up, and the beaver dam actually blew out. And so, when you think about natural river processes and the migratory nature of waterways, this waterway didn't blow out and go through the knotweed patch because it was in a mood, right? Because it was in that migratory trajectory. That was almost accidental. It went back to the main stem, it left that behind, and it got rid of the beaver dam eventually. So that was really interesting. And what I found there was this other sort of means of spread that I hadn't envisioned as part of that original sort of theorizing. And you can see here the knotweed is just sort of lying around. And I found this stalk, right? So it's fallen down, but this stalk is actually breaking off. The weight of the leaves on the bank is enough to sort of lever the thing out and break it off from the bank. And so it's not merely or simply or only the flood processes. The knotweed may well be feeding itself to its dispersal mechanism. So back to that slide, right? We've got lots of different processes going along in the river, lots of fluvial geomorphology at play. There's potentially more than one kind, 3, maybe 4, depending on how you count that last slide, kinds of erosion happening. The loss of biodiversity that invasives just do, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to talk about in terms of we've got the hints and the chain of logic and some observations, as well as the beginning of some, better than pilot projects, science happening. So what this means is that, to my mind at least, right? The plant is its own seed bank primarily. And if it is spreading because of floods, which are gonna, the hydrological cycle is gonna get a little bit flashier with, with climate change, especially in the Northeast, and presumably lots of other places. If you can figure out how to control knotweed and prioritize certain sections of knotweed, you've got this sort of triple bottom line partnership opportunity where economics, social situations, as well as ecological ones, you've got opportunity, right? The metaphor I use a lot is that this is a rounding error doing a really expensive invasive species job, which knotweed is, no matter how you frame it. It's really expensive, but if you're doing this to protect a bridge or a culvert or to a road, I mean, it's a rounding error. It doesn't even contribute to the budget, for putting one of these together, which means you open up ideas for who you can partner with and who is a co-beneficiary, right? If you change the amount of soil going into the river, that's a whole other group of people. If you talk to homeowners, it's a whole other group of people. You've really got opportunity to get out of our usual lane of tree huggers and ecology enthusiasts and the such. So to sort of stick with that money idea, coming out of British Columbia, they spend a major part of their budget, 600K a year out of 2.4 mil on knotweed control, right? And this is the transportation ministry recognizing that knotweed is impacting its work and making an effort, and it's dominating this ministry's ecology work, if you will. Getting into risks, either legal or financial, about having knotweed on site. This is out of Massachusetts, relatively recent, last year. And to oversimplify, a developer brought in bad fill. Considering it bad fill was due partly to the presence of knotweed that he had been warned about was in the fill. And then when it came up in the homeowner's soil, the homeowner ended up getting like 300K in judgment off of the house that they bought was something in the vein of 600. And so there's, to my knowledge, there's no relevant regulatory, legal situation to sort of prevent something like that happening. But we do have now a legal precedent saying knotweed is bad fill, and that means that you shouldn't put it on your site or risk the courts having an issue with you. As well, this is the New York Times, when they had a flood come through Stony Point, New York on Monday, right? That to me looks like a giant pile of flood debris, knotweed. So, the New York Times didn't know what they were posting, but I did. Right? This is all at play. Now getting back to early detection, right? And the price of things. How much does it cost to take this on? And sort of, if you've got a climate emergency like a flood, then what? How do you handle knotweed in this context? Well, again, back to the Mad River. That field in the back, they've been there twice, and they've picked up 2,500 propagules and gotten them out of that field. Mind you, this field, there's a lot going on. There's let's see over here, between the 2023, the two lines, you can see that's a knotweed horizon up against the back, and it's knotweed all the way over here. Also in the foreground, they're experimenting with goat management. So there's a lot going on, but in the floods of December, it was a receiving end location. Now I'm going to cut back to Élisabeth.
So I think the question of cost is extremely relevant. We can get rid of knotweed. I mean, it's a plant that you can kill, but how much does it cost to do it? Well, what if you're doing a rapid response campaign? So in 2020, we went along about 10 kilometers of riverbank, pulling out every knotweed fragment that we found. So these are the fragments that would have been dispersed during the winter and spring ice breakups and just started to root. We found 737 rhizome fragments, and it took us 63 person-hours to pull them out or dig them up. Now upstream, this upstream section of the river has a much lower density of knotweed colonies, and we only found 21 rhizome fragments, and to find and dig up these fragments took 24 hours. Now we reasoned that if we were going to do a rapid response campaign for knotweed, we would not do it in a stretch of river that was already heavily infested, so the red stretch of river. But it might be worthwhile to do it in a stretch of river where there's very little knotweed to start with. So if we extrapolate the results from 2020, let's say for 50 kilometers of shoreline, we estimate it would take 120 person-hours to remove approximately 55 knotweed fragments that would have been generated that year. Labor and transportation costs would amount to around $5,800, and that gives a cost per aborted clone of $105. Now, what we mean by aborted clone is if we left it, it would eventually grow into a massive monster clone of knotweed. But now we've nipped it in the bud when it's small, and it only cost $105. We consider this to be reasonable and realistic for parts of the river that we wish to protect from further invasion.
And then that's not the only study that sort of did the math that way. In France, they've also done work like this, and their math turned out differently. But again, they got $280 a plant, which is pretty good, considering the costs potentially when you think of what the British Columbia slide was showing. The other thing too is that, sometimes you get some real honkers, right? It's not always just the little ones. That particular one that you've got there on this slide was like giant. It was epic. And again, this is something that was able to come out with several people, so it's not always cut and dried. It's not always straightforward, but if you can keep up with the floods and get down to it, I cannot imagine what it would take to have used chemicals or mechanical or goats to handle what that particular fragment would have grown into.
Sometimes, though, you don't have the choice. You really do need to remove giant clones, giant patches of knotweed. This might be the case if you're doing road work around a bridge. Often knotweed grows right up to the bridges along the river. And in Quebec, if you excavate soil contaminated with knotweed, it's considered a contaminated soil, and it has to be sent to a secure contaminated soil waste management site. This is prohibitively expensive, and it wastes an otherwise good soil. So we partnered with the industry in Thetford Mines. In 2019, we started a project to see if we could treat soil that was infested with knotweed roots, rhizomes, stalks. So here's what the setup looked like. You start with your infested soil. In our case, it was mostly sand with some silt and clay. It had the entire knotweed plants. The knotweed plants were not cut before excavation. It had the roots, the rhizomes, the stems. It had rocks in it. And the first step was to feed it into an impact crusher. This crusher has two strong metal jaws that hit together and crush the rocks and everything you put into it. Once the material has gone through the crusher, it's fed into a screener. This was a McCloskey 150 screener with two screens, and it separated the soil into 3 different fractions. So you get your first soil fraction at the end of the conveyor belt, and it's the 0 to 10 millimeter fraction of soil, and we consider that clean. We consider that soil has been treated for knotweed. The other 2 fractions, the 10 to 25 and the over 25 millimeter, they were fed back into the impact crusher for a second round of treatment. And we kept feeding the larger pieces back into the crusher until almost everything had made it through the crusher and the screener. Then we wanted to do a long-term follow-up to make sure that we actually had treated the soil. So here's what the experimental site looked like. First, you have 3 mounds here of untreated soil. So that's the soil as it came from the excavation. Then we had 3 mounds of soil that had been crushed and screened. So this is the 0 to 10 millimeter fraction of soil. And then finally, we had 3 mounds of soil that were crushed and screened and covered with a thick geomembrane, which is a high density polyethylene. This was not permeable to water. And so this experiment was done in the month of June, and we removed the membrane in the month of September. And here's what happened. So in the control mounds, we had a massive outbreak of Itadori stems. I counted thousands and thousands of them. You can see we had numbers like 12,391 stems per 100 meters square. So it's really easy to grow knotweed if you're trying to grow it. For the soil that we sent through the crusher and the screener, we still got a few knotweed plants. We got 265 per 100 square meters. What you're seeing on those mounds is actually mostly white clover and other weeds, but not knotweed. The knotweeds were far and few between. In fact, if you do the math, it's a 98% reduction by crushing and screening. So it's pretty good, but it's not really good enough to say, yes, we can use the soil and make a park out of it, for example. However, when you add the geomembrane on top of the crushing and the screening, the soil bakes in the summer heat. Anything that tries to grow is just stopped by the geomembrane, and we found no plants whatsoever under the geomembrane. So we're going from where we might have had 12,000 plants down to 0. So we were super happy with this result. There's been a few pilot projects using this method. Actually, they're beyond pilot projects now. The method has been approved by the Quebec government for treating soil and it's been used in a few projects across the province. So we no longer have to landfill this soil.
Just wanted to let you know that we're at 12:55, so we're kind of wrapping up if you want to get to a couple more questions.
No, that's perfect timing. This is the last slide. So what Élisabeth just put out there, right, is a solution that fits into sort of the climate resiliency risk that knotweed is presenting, right? Especially when we think of the built environment and the riparian environment and where they intersect and the risks that sort of uninformed decision making might make where you send knotweed downstream by accident or where the knotweed infests the roadway. And we knew we had a problem. We knew we had a linkage with the erosion and the climate change, but to sort of in that frame of reference, in that line of work, in that profession, there's no option for doing ecology, if you will. But they've got the machines, they've got the machinery. We've got a solution here for them in this context. And so there's ways to sort of open up a conversation and then bring it to something useful and hopeful rather than just saying, like add it to the pile of things that are going wrong, right? And so what does this give us, right? If you shift your frame from being sort of a natural resource manager or an invasive species specialist, and you think of how can you make your built environment more resilient? How can you prevent bridges from washing away in emergency management situations? How can you think about regular budgeting versus emergency spending at the municipal level? Water quality. One of the slides, sorry, not one of the slides, one of the pieces that Élisabeth covered, I believe, they speak about actually the volume of soil that washes downstream. The work on the Etchemin where they had the GPS dots, they actually figured out it'd be like 5,000 tons of soil lost over that river over the course of the flood event because of knotweed. So there's a way to connect with just about anybody interested in a waterway or something adjacent to a waterway and meet them where they are. Instead of bringing this as an invasive species problem, we can bring it as whatever problem they're working on, it's that too. And so if you can just sort of shift the frame of reference and take some of the information like what we've had here today, you all of a sudden have a climate resiliency opportunity, right? This isn't a risk, this is an opportunity, right? This isn't a downer, this is a positive, right? You can get in there and give something to somebody who needs it. And relatively speaking, as expensive as knotweed work is, it's generally cheaper than most of the items in the budgets that I've sort of put out as an example on the sidebar here. So with that, I think Élisabeth and I are done. And I'll turn this off, and yeah, we'll see if there's any more Q&A we want to cover.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions. One was, have you tracked activity on utility easement as points of knotweed infestation?
We haven't done any studies in that sense, so I can't really comment on it. Although I do know that with the Phragmites, the common reed, we have linked that to roadworks machines spreading the plants. So I imagine for knotweed it would also be possible because they both these plants spread with rhizomes.
If you have a reference, I think someone would like a reference for the amount transportation spends on knotweed control in BC. So if you have that, maybe if you could drop that in the chat.
That one I don't know. I've got a little bit from around New England, but again, it's just sort of more like project specific rather than, you know, the department.
Once a knotweed is gone, what do you do to restore the native plant mixture?
That is a deep rabbit hole. That is a very deep rabbit hole. That's a whole other hour-long webinar.
Really quickly, how long was the geomembrane in place for?
We put it in place in June, and we removed it in September.
All right, just in the interest of time, I just wanted to do a quick wrap up. I'm sure if you have any questions, you can feel free to email our speakers and I'll try to get to them as soon as they can, if that's okay. I do want to share my screen because we would love to have folks, you know, if you liked what you saw, if you could, you know, would like to engage with us more, please come check us out on these websites, join our listservs. And if you have any questions, yeah, please feel free to email either the Northeast Risk Group or the Northwest Risk Group. And with that, I'll hang around a little bit. I don't know if the speakers are going to be able to hang out for a couple of minutes, but thank you for attending and learn a lot of good stuff. And if, yeah, stay tuned for more exciting talks. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.